Introducing aPriori.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to aPriori Pro Tips and Tricks. I'm Eric Oswald, the North American Implementation Manager at aPriori. And in today's session, we're going to cover tips and tricks that will help make you more efficient and productive as an aPriori user. The tips and tricks will be related to initializing, or initially generating manufacturing simulation data, the organization of that data, reviewing the manufacturing assumptions, and updating where applicable. Let's get tricky.
It's tricky to rock around, that's right, on time is tricky. It's tricky.
Initializing begins by opening up a part within aPriori. So when I open up a CAD model in aPriori, I will get an uninitialized scenario of that component. Now, from there, I can define my production information in the cost guide, or if there's a similar part that's already in the database that I want to copy the manufacturing assumptions from, I have the ability to search using my recently used settings to search for a scenario in order to copy my inputs from. Now, we do need to be careful when we do this because it's going to copy everything: the process group, digital factory, the material, the production volumes, but also the secondary processes and any overrides that have been placed on that previous scenario that we're copying from. Now, initializing parts is simple. It starts to get a little more complex when we initialize large assemblies. So we start by opening the CAD model, defining the production information in the cost guide, and then costing the part. At that time, aPriori will extract all the subcomponents and subassemblies. Now, from here, if it's a really large assembly, what I like to do is switch my view and my assembly details from a tree view to list. This will give me a breakdown of all of my parts and all of my subassemblies. Now, from here, in this table view, I can select all of the subassemblies and initialize all at once. Same goes if it was a roll-up. You have the ability to multiple select any uninitialized scenario and process in bulk. Now, while that's processing, I'm going to handle these parts or subcomponents by copying this table and pasting it into a pre-formatted CSV file. Now, I'm sure most of you know how to manipulate Excel, so I'm just going to bring up a fully formatted version. Now, in here, I have a few columns. I have the level, the part number, the scenario that I want to update, and then I have some other information on the right side that I'm bulk importing into the system. So for all my purchase components, I am identifying the price. Manually costed will be true. The finished mass I'm importing in order to get a weight roll-up. And then if you define an assembly type, we have the ability to set up the system to automatically include assembly operations. Now, you will notice at the bottom of my file, I also have all the subcomponents that I want to process through a digital factory. But the reason why they're in here is because I want to take those uninitialized scenarios that are within that assembly right now, and I want to create initialized versions of them in aPriori. Now, if I come back to aPriori, I can see all of these parts are uninitialized. Now, if I go to my BOM loader, so in Digital Factory Toolset, and point a priori to the CSV file that I created and select the mapping that is previously set up to load in all those column headers to the fields in a priori, I can then update all the scenarios that are listed in that file upon import. So a priori will go through each row and it will update the scenarios that are in my a priori database. Now, coming back to a priori, I can see after I bomb loaded all those subcomponents, all my standard catalog parts now have a price associated with them. But all the ones that were not manually costed and I want to run through a digital factory have a red X. And that's completely fine. Because again, all I had done was create and initialize these subcomponents so that I could copy my assembly inputs to children. Now, this only works if you have initialized scenarios. So I'm going to select the production information from the top level and copy these volumes down to each subcomponent. What this will do is it takes the annual volume of the top level assembly and it multiplies it by the quantity that's listed in this assembly. Now, at this point, I can then use my deep costing in order to define my production inputs for all of my subcomponents and process this assembly in batch. Now, the deep costing will open up a separate window in order for you to define all of these inputs. So once this file opens, I'm going to do a few things first, really quick. I've identified the catalog parts and I'm going to ignore those when I'm processing because I've already loaded in the price and I don't need to rerun those scenarios. So if I order by any of these column headers, I can select multiple scenarios and I can ignore. Now, for all the other ones, I'm going to need to define the process group, material, etc. But the one thing that I don't need to define now is my annual volumes because I have pushed assembly inputs to children. Now, once I've defined all the production inputs, the process group, digital factory, and material, I can then click the cost button and it will process all of these in batch. Think of it like a microwave. And I've just clicked the popcorn button. I can then go and do other daily activities while I wait for this to initialize all of the subcomponents within this large assembly. Now you may be asking yourself, what if I don't have an assembly and I want to do this on parts themselves? Well, we can do that too. So within a priori, we have the ability to open multiple CAD files at once. So I'll navigate to where the files are and I'll multi-select these CAD files. When I do this and click open, it's going to open each individual CAD file. Now, if I have a predefined dynamic rollup, I'm able to capture all of these uninitialized scenarios that get generated when I open them. And what do I mean by that? So I've created a dynamic rollup that has certain search criteria. Now, we can see no parts are being collected into this dynamic rollup. And that's because I need to edit my search criteria. So all of these scenario names, I have a date code in my username. So if I update this dynamic rollup to search for components with this scenario name that are uninitialized, I will get a collection of all of the uninitialized subcomponents. Now from here, I can either, again, multi-select and initialize, or I can use that deep cost as I had used within the assembly. Now, when this window opens up, again, I am defining all my processing inputs for each subcomponent. What I'm going to do, if I'm costing in batch, I'm going to set my cost maturity to initial and my status to new. We'll talk about what that is doing later. And then I can batch process. Now, let's say, oh, wait, I have a surface treatment on one of these parts. I have a painting, and I want to define the key inputs for a painting before I cost. Now, in my deep costing window, I have that capability before I cost to edit the process setup options on a given secondary treatment. So now what this does is it will automatically include my powder coat, and those inputs or those overrides for the process setup options will be effective on that part when I hit cost. Woo! Let that popcorn pop, baby.
It's tricky to rock around, that's right, on time is tricky. It's tricky.
Woo! We covered a lot of ground there. 10 total tips and tricks and 10 related to initializing components in the aPriori database, ranging anywhere from copying inputs to initialize a singular part to handling large assemblies by changing it to list view, initializing your subassemblies, bomb loading, and then deep costing after that. We also covered opening multiple parts in order to batch process, just like we did the assembly. Now, our next topic is organization. Now, I know it may not seem like the most exciting topic, but organizing the data in the database is very important. Think of the aPriori database like your kitchen. If you just put your utensils and throw them in random drawers, it's going to be a headache for you to find the correct utensil to use when you want a meal. And the same goes for the aPriori data. Now, in the aPriori cost guide, we have what are called company-defined attributes, or UDAs, which allow us to give contextual information about that scenario. This aids in searching, enables effective reporting, and also, again, gives you contextual information, your future self and others, about that scenario. Now, I'm sure you noticed when I initialized all of these parts in bulk, I defined my status as new and the cost maturity as initial. This informs my future self and somebody else that I have just batch processed this and I have not reviewed any of the information or the manufacturing assumptions on this scenario. Once I do, I can update this tag to inform other people that I feel the cost maturity is low, medium, or high. Now, I'm sure you noticed that there's a few company-defined attributes that seem to be auto-populated. And you're not mistaken. We have the ability to auto-populate some of these by mapping them to CAD attributes. Now, the same goes for the material. I've created an attribute to map the CAD material to a field in aPriori And I'm also able to add some logic that will then automatically assign the aPriori standard material from the CAD material name. And I've used some regex logic to do that, just to make sure if their names aren't consistently defined, I can still capture the proper material and help make the user not have to define the material. Now, when scenarios are sufficiently tagged, we can utilize dynamic rollups to create a collection of parts and/or assemblies that match a specific search criteria. Now, these can be useful for structured workflows, prioritizing tasks, collaborating with others in aPriori Pro, or even track activities on particular projects. Now, to create a dynamic rollup, we go to File, New Dynamic Rollup. Now, let's say I want a dynamic rollup of all the new scenarios that I need to review. I then create the dynamic rollup and I identify the search criteria that I want to use. So I want all the new parts, and I also want all the cost maturity as initial. So this will find all of those subcomponents that I batch processed within the aPriori database, and it will put them in a container. And as I change those tags, this dynamic rollup will dynamically update and remove from new to complete. Now, there are also artifacts in aPriori called rollups, and these are very similar to dynamic rollups, but they require you to manually add components to that rollup. So if we go to File, New Rollup, and I'm going to create a rollup of a project. Now, at this time, I either need to add components by searching the database, or I can, even if I have the items open, I can go to View, Show Navigation, Open Items, and I can drag and drop these into this rollup. Now, rollups are most useful for gathering and organizing data that will be used for future analysis in aPriori's reporting tool, or Cost Insight Report. And this is because dynamic rollups only save the search criteria, not the full container of scenarios that are beneath it. So I can also define attributes on the rollup itself. So let's say in the Cost Insight reporting database, I want to report target cost of a collection of parts that are not in assembly. So I've created this rollup, and if I go to Edit Properties, I can then define a target cost for the collection of parts that are within this rollup.
It's tricky to rock around, that's right, on time is tricky. It's tricky.
So our tip and trick counter is now at 17, with 7 of them focused on getting you organized in the aPriori database by utilizing user-defined attributes, potentially mapping them from CAD, and creating collections of parts either dynamically with a dynamic rollup or manually with a regular one. Now that we have the estimates in the aPriori system and initially organized, I can then start to review. Now, at this point, I might be the person who initially generated the manufacturing simulation, or I might be reviewing someone else's work. If the latter is true, I'm going to want to go to my cost override summary. This will give me context to if, how, and hopefully why the manufacturing assumptions were modified. If they haven't left comments on overrides that were made, you might want to check your notes because they can also be captured there. Now, if you're like me and hate doing mental math all the time, before I start reviewing, I'm going to want to make sure my unit system settings are in units that I'm used to seeing. So I'm going to update this to English units because we are in the US. Now from here, I'm going to go to my part summary tab. This will give me high-level information about the scenario that I have open. One of the interesting sections that I enjoy a lot is the percent cost by process. This will give me a breakdown of which processes are driving the cost of my component the most. The other nice feature is if you select on the process, it will highlight the features in the part viewer that's being produced at that stage. Now, if I want more contextual information or more granular information on this scenario, I can then navigate to my part details. This will allow me to select a table view that will display the pertinent information that I would like to see. Now, it might look like it's going to be cumbersome to update these cells and fit to size, but if you hover in the top left-hand corner, there'll be a hidden button that appears, and you can do it quite quickly and easily. But there's more. We have the ability to create custom table views so that I can organize the information in the format that I want to see it. So if I create a new one, I would then just use these arrows to move information from one area to the next. Now, I've created some custom table views that I think help me review machine components. The first being the custom outputs. This custom outputs are going to be different for every process group, but they give very good information and detail on what the estimate, the manufacturing simulation estimate, is about. It gives me information about the material stock, about roughing versus finishing, etc. Now, if I want to see the formula dependencies of what else goes into the cycle time, I can also change my table view to my machining review. And then dig into what we call our formula dependencies. So if I select the row that has the process I want to look into, I can right-click and then show formula dependencies. This will allow me to give me a breakdown of the time estimate that's being generated by aPriori. Now, there may be some cases where you see that a bulk of the time is summing child operations. Now, if this is the case, the times can be then seen in your geometric cost driver window because operations are performed on GCDs. So if I then navigate down to my geometric cost driver window, I can select the types of GCDs I want to review, and I can even order them by time, which will give me a little information about which GCDs are the most important to review. Now, if I'm more of a visual person, for machining, we also might want to check out the heat map. The heat map has either design criterion, but also has a very visual way of trying to see what the estimate is comprised of. Now, if I go to my finished milling operation type, it will show me the types of operations that are being performed on what surfaces. I can also see a quick breakdown of the cycle times and which features are driving cost on this given part. Now, we've covered a lot about reviewing a part, but these table views also are available within roll-ups and assemblies. So one really good thing about a roll-up is if you loaded in your quoted cost, we have an outlier analysis view where we can, if we switch to the list option, we can go and see and sort the annualized savings that we'll potentially get from the given parts within this roll-up. So it allows me to see which parts I should then go focus on when I'm negotiating. This is a quick way to do it in the UI, but you also have this flexibility in Cost Insight Report.
rock around, that's right, on time is tricky. It's tricky.
Another 10 down. And I know what you're thinking. Is that counter correct? And trust me, it is. It's just dependent on what your definition of a tip or a trick is. It could be as simple as showing you a hidden button that will allow you to resize your columns in table views. Or it could be as detailed as creating your own custom table view, and anywhere in between, including reviewing the cost override summary or digging into formula dependencies. But now that we know how to review a priori manufacturing simulations, there may be instances where we want to update the manufacturing assumptions to better align with the real world manufacturing. Now, in a priori, in your details tab, any cell that has a pencil mark next to it will allow you to create an override. So we can override the labor rate at a high level. We also override the total cycle time for injection molding. Now, before you just override at this level, I would recommend you dig into some of the formula dependencies. This will allow me to see the mechanistic processing parameters that are driving that cycle time. And I can also update those parameters rather than the cycle time as a whole. So let's say the mold temperature is actually 200 degrees Fahrenheit. I can modify that and rerun the simulation to see the impact on time and cost. Now, there may also be higher level manufacturing assumptions that need to be modified and not as granular as the mechanistic processing parameters. Now, this is a plastic part, and I noticed that there's hard tooling required to produce this plastic part. When this was initially costed, it was determined that the United States was the region of manufacture for this part. But is that the same place that the tooling is manufactured? If it's not, I do have the ability to select a different digital factory to manufacture my tooling versus my part. Now, maybe there's also a secondary process that I notice is missing on this scenario. I go to the optional processes and I don't see it. Now, what do? Am I stuck? No. In aPriori, we have the ability to create a custom routing and specifically create a custom process. So maybe there's a custom surface treatment that we want to include on this part. Now, we can make this custom process as mechanistic as we want, like cycle time based, or as simplistic. Could just be $5 each, or anywhere in between. Now, because it's a surface treatment, I'm going to assume that it's going to be based on surface area. Once I define the model type, I can then scroll down and change the process setup option related to this. It's going to be produced on the entire part, and my cost per area is going to be $5 per foot. Then it will pop up in my available processes, and I can drag and drop it into the routing sequence. Now, this will allow me to generate an estimate that includes that custom surface treatment. Now, if you haven't caught on already, all of these modification updates that I'm making on at one part at a time, we also have flexibility of doing that on assemblies or parts. Now, within a roll-up, we can select multiple parts, and if we wanted to update the digital factory for the tool, and I could also do that on multiple parts at one time. Or if I wanted to add that custom process to all of the parts within this roll-up, I can also do that as well. Now, let's say we've reviewed all of our manufacturing assumptions and we feel comfortable with the a priori estimate and the manufacturing simulation. But there may be other what-if scenarios that we want to run. Like, what if it was done in a different region or at different production volumes? Now, that is a great candidate for using what we call as matrix costing. So matrix costing allows you the flexibility to define different parameters that you want to process that given part or scenario in. And then we'll add them to a matrix in order to then open up the deep costing window and process again them in batch. Now, there might be situations that matrix costing can't help me with. So it's very good at creating scenarios for different region or regional analysis or production volumes. It's amazing for that. But in aPriori, maybe I want a different what-if scenario. What about cavitation, etc.? So I can either deep cost the rollup or on a singular part, click cost scenario, which will open, again, that deep costing window and allow me to create additional scenarios from there. Now, let's say on this, I want to update my cavitation. I can right click and create from this row, and this will allow me to create a new scenario for this given part number. And I could create as many what-if situations as I want. Now I can just come in here and change my edit process routing, and I can update my cavitation on this given scenario. The flexibility within create from this row is a little more flexible than matrix costing, obviously, which includes modifying of process setup options, adding different secondary processes. So let's say you want to do a scenario for steel versus stainless steel that's nickel plated versus stainless steel. You have a lot more flexibility. Now, aPriori also does have a very flexible tool that's called bulk costing. Bulk costing allows me to define all of the inputs in a spreadsheet and point aPriori to a folder location that contains the parts and allow me to process those in bulk. But the key thing that we'll need to have here is, how do I know the column headers required to generate the inputs? So if there are certain process parameters that you want to update, the easiest way to understand what the headers need to be is cost a part just in the main UI with all of the overrides that you may want. Could be the process setup options, surface treatments, a custom surface treatment. And then when you go to cost scenario, again, it will open this deep costing window. And from here, we can go file, export user inputs to spreadsheet. And then what this will do is it will give you the notation for how to define those column headers in order to define the overrides that you'd want to make on a per part basis in plastic molding. So I guess what I'm trying to say is bulk costing is the most flexible. You can override anything from the routing sequence, custom processing, the process setup options, those formula dependencies that we overrode, like labor rate. You can do so much with bulk costing if it's defined in the user input spreadsheet. Now, with power comes a cost. Bulk costing is separately licensed, but again, is a very, very powerful tool.
It's tricky to rock around, that's right, on time is tricky. It's tricky.
And that brings us to a total of 35 tips and tricks. That's a new world record for the most consecutive aPriori Pro tips and tricks performed in sequence. And in our last section, we covered how to alter the aPriori estimate assumptions. And we reviewed how to do that on singular parts and also being a little more efficient by doing it in bulk and in batch. Thank you.
aPriori, making profitability and sustainability a reality for a better world.